Start. So I welcome all of you on the behalf of Yazanas Foundation for this a very interesting and relevant discussion today on the Islamist organizations. I'll just like to give you a brief background. In India, like we have been the victim of terrorism for last 3 decades. We mostly dealt with terrorist organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen. But this whole idea of organizations like Jamaat-e-Islami or Muslim Brotherhood, or even I would say the organizations which are not overtly violent in nature, but they pursue the cause of Islamist and jihadist radicalization. So, how to deal with such organizations? That was a big question. In Kashmir, we saw that in the 2016 post Burhan Wani's encounter, there was this huge unrest in which Jamaat-e-Islami, an Islamist organization, which I would also call the South Asian brother or cousin of Muslim Brotherhood, played a very critical role in that unrest. So that was a big question, how to deal with such organizations. In the recent past also, PFI is one such organization which has played a very destructive role recently in the Delhi riots and Bangalore riots. So today we are here to discuss the impact of such organizations, and all our esteemed panelists are experts in this area. I would like to introduce all of them. Cliff is a great friend, and Cliff is working with Middle East Forum. He is the director of Washington Project. Abha Shankar, she is the Director of Research with Investigative Project on Terrorism. And Sam Westrop is also with the Middle East Forum, working as a Director, Islamist Watch Project. I welcome all of you. And before I begin our panelists to start, I would also like to welcome Lieutenant General Rameshwar Rai. He has been a great mentor. Sir, I welcome you. He's a veteran dealing with intelligence affairs for like last 30, 35 years. Now he's retired, but he brings an amazing insight in all these matters. Has worked in Kashmir for long. I'll begin with Abha Shankar. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Abhinav. It's a pleasure to be among friends. I'm going to be talking about some of the more prominent US-based Islamist groups that have a long and active presence in North America. And I'm going to focus particularly on their more recent malicious campaign that they've launched against India, especially after the Indian government revoked Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir and passed the Citizenship Amendment Act. So who are these groups? The first one, of course, and the most prominent is USCMO, which is the US Council of Muslim Organizations. And USCMO is an Islamist coalition group. It's an umbrella group comprising of the country's top Islamist groups, including the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, Islamic Circle of North America, ICNA, American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, and many others. USCMO was launched in 2014, and it has an overtly political agenda. Every year, it sponsors the National Muslim Advocacy Day on the Hill, where Muslim American activists from across the country, they kind of congregate and seek to influence policymakers in issues of concern to the Muslim American community, and of course, issues related to the Muslim Ummah. The IPT first exposed the very close nexus between USCMO and Turkey. This was way back in 2016. And they have very close ties. They routinely visit Turkey and meet with Erdogan. And they also invite speakers from the AK party and others affiliated with the Islamist party in Turkey to their events. Soon after the abrogation of Article 370, USCMO, like a delegation from this organization, met with Sardar Masood Khan. He's the president of Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir at the Pakistani embassy, and they pledged their support to the Pakistani position on Kashmir. A USCMO delegation also met with representatives from the OIC, that is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the United Nations in New York, and basically to apprise them of the situation in Kashmir and to demand that they apply maximum pressure on India regarding the lockdown, to lift the lockdown, which, as we all know, was implemented because of the fragile security situation in the region and the cross-border terrorism coming in from Pakistan. And they also demanded that OIC and United Nations pressure India to carry out a plebiscite in the region. USCMO also has asked its supporters to petition their congressmen and women to speak up against so-called human rights abuses in Kashmir and against the CAA. The Islamist coalition also described the riots, the unfortunate riots in Delhi earlier this year, as a government-sponsored pogrom against Indian Muslims. And we all know that both Muslims and Hindus died in the riots. And now evidence is coming to the fore that there is this radical Islamist organization called the Popular Front of India that has been behind instigating and sponsoring the riots. Another important group which has been engaging in a lot of anti-India advocacy is the Council on American-Islamic Relations. CAIR is the single largest Islamist organization in the United States. It was established in 1994 and operates under the guise of a civil rights organization. CAIR has its roots in a Muslim Brotherhood-created Hamas support network called the Palestine Committee. The Palestine Committee was set up by Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood activists in North America to advocate on behalf of Hamas, to fundraise for Hamas, to engage in propaganda for Hamas. And Hamas, as we all know, is a designated terrorist group that has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and Israelis. CAIR has also spoken out in support of convicted terrorists, individuals who have been convicted in US courts of law, such as the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development. Holy Land Foundation was the charitable arm of the Palestine Committee. 5 of its senior leaders were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms by a court in Dallas for funneling over $12 million to Hamas. And CAIR contends that they are not terrorists. CAIR has also spoken out in support of senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad operative Sami Al-Arian. Al-Arian was convicted for material support to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is another proscribed organization and seeks the destruction of Israel. And he was, as part of his plea agreement, he was deported to Turkey. And as we all know, Turkey has always provided asylum to senior Hamas leaders, senior Muslim Brotherhood leaders. So for Al-Arian, Turkey is a very good fit. And he's there and he set up this organization called the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, and routinely hosts conferences on Palestine and Kashmir. On August 9th, this was last month, CAIR Philadelphia hosted a webinar featuring Hafsa Kanjwal. She's a rising star of the Kashmiri separatist movement in the United States and a co-founder of Stand With Kashmir. Middle East Forum's Martha Lee did a brilliant expose on Stand With Kashmir, its connections with terrorists and Islamists. And I would encourage all of you to read that brilliant expose. So Hafsa Kanjwal has also spoken at CIGA events in Turkey. CAIR has a long history of undermining law enforcement, counterterrorism investigations. It has told its supporters not to cooperate with the FBI. It calls government sting operations, entrapment operations, and not known to many, the FBI cut off outreach communication with CAIR in 2008 because of its associations with Hamas. That policy remains in effect. Then another group is the Islamic Circle of North America. It is the topmost Jamaat-e-Islami front group in the United States. It was created in the 1960s by Jamaat brothers emigrating from Bangladesh and Pakistan to the United States, and they thought of creating a Jamaat or an organization to propagate the ideology of the Jamaat-e-Islami. Jamaat-e-Islami ideology is mirrored in ICNA's teachings and publications that seek to establish Iqamat ad-Din, or the establishment of the religion in the United States. ICNA conventions that it co-hosts with the Muslim American Society, which is the Brotherhood's arm in the United States and was established in 1993, and draws hundreds of thousands of Muslim Americans 2 times a year, features always a session on Kashmir. And convicted Pakistani lobbyist and spy Ghulam Nabi Fai routinely speaks at these conventions. And lately, they've also had speakers from Stand With Kashmir. Last month, ICNA hosted a digital chain event on Kashmir featuring Ghulam Nabi Mir of the World Kashmir Awareness Forum, Osama Abu Ashed of American Muslims for Palestine, that also hosts, along with events in Palestine, it also hosts events in Kashmir, and kind of draws a comparison between the 2 conflicts, which I believe Cliff is going to be expanding on. Then, of course, there is the Indian American Muslim Council, the IAMC. This was formerly known as the Indian Muslim Council. It was founded by Sheikh Mohammed Obaid. Obaid was the former Secretary General of ICNA. He started with establishing an organization called Coalition Against Genocide. And he's also affiliated with a bunch of groups such as the Alliance for Justice and Accountability, Muslim Peace Coalition. And his primary focus is to engage in Modi bashing and draw comparisons of, with of the BJP government with Nazi Germany, basically calling the current government in India as a racist, genocidal regime that is kind of targeting Muslims and disenfranchising them. IAMC was very proactive, along with CARE, in advocating against the CAA at the USCIRF. In January, they co-sponsored a congressional briefing that featured speakers from IAMC, and of course there was CARE's executive director, Nihad Awad, who's very closely affiliated with Hamas. He was also a speaker at the briefing, and so was USCIRF policy analyst Harrison Ikins. Soon after that, USCIRF issued a legislation fact sheet authored by Ikins, alleging that CAA was basically a religious test and it sought to disenfranchise Indian Muslims. So there was a lot of false propaganda at USCIRF, which was propagated with the help of all these Islamist groups. Soon after, USCIRF listed India as a country of particular concern, along with 14 other countries, including gross human rights violators such as Iran, North Korea, and Syria, which is laughable. Ikins is the protege of the Muslim Brotherhood Tide Akbar Ahmed, who is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University. So there are a lot of connections with the Muslim Brotherhood groups. Through their events and publications, these Islamist groups seek to change the narrative on Kashmir, the CAA, and paint the Modi government as a fascist, genocidal regime. I want to wrap up with a cautionary note. If these efforts to change the narrative on Kashmir and push an anti-India agenda remain unchallenged, it will only embolden the Islamists and their allies to spread more lies and will come back to haunt India, impact its international stature, and of course, impact US-India relations in the years to come. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abha, for your amazing insights on the subject. We'll come back to you after our other speakers share their thoughts and experiences. I'd like to go to Sam. Sam, please join in with your thoughts and your ideas on the subject.
Thank you. And that was an extremely extensive overview of the Islamist forces at work in America, which I thought was excellently done. So thank you, Abha. The thing I think that I'd like to expand on a little is the role of charity within those networks, charitable infrastructure, and those moments in which these Jamaat-e-Islami, these Muslim Brotherhood groups that Abha mentioned, move away from political activism and lobbying and manipulation of media and politics, and directly get into terrorism, or at the very least, subsidy of violent ideas. There are two huge Islamist charities operating in the West. That's a lie. There are actually hundreds of huge Islamist charities operating in the West, but there are two big, prominent Islamist charities operating in the West at the moment. One is called Islamic Relief. It's a charity set up by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s in Britain. And another is Muslim Aid. Muslim Aid was set up by Jamaat-e-Islami, in fact, by a Jamaat-e-Islami war criminal who fled Bangladesh after the 1971 war. Both these charities receive tens of millions of dollars from Western governments around the world. And they use that money, yes, to do charity most of the time. They do feed the hungry, they do house the homeless, but they also subsidize terror. Islamic Relief does this in the Gaza Strip by funding charitable youth groups, community centers, orphanages, all run by Hamas, all of which benefit Hamas because they're part of its welfare program. Muslim Aid is much the same. Across the world, it funds the welfare arm of extremist movements. And that's also true in South Asia, where Muslim Aid is closely involved with groups like Al-Khidmat, the charitable arm of Jamaat-e-Islami, involved with all sorts of other charitable proxies for Kashmiri and Pakistani Islamists. And Muslim Aid isn't just funding these proxies, it's also moving money and support into actual terrorist groups. And a number of investigations over the last few decades have found that Muslim Aid has been directly involved with jihadists at times, including jihadists in Tunisia, radicals in Kashmir, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. In fact, Muslim Aid has admitted on several occasions to its money, its funds, its support ending up in the hands of these extremists, these terrorists. So these two enormous Western charities funded by Western taxpayers are funding terrorism across the globe. And they're also very involved in the question of Kashmir. They're getting involved in the webinars. They're getting involved in the campaigning initiatives organized by the other Islamists that Abba has mentioned, all across the US and across the UK as well. Charity is particularly hard to criticize. Unlike one of the groups Abba mentioned, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, that's a political organization. Charitable organizations have a natural shield. They're philanthropists. They're benevolent providers of food and aid. It's much more difficult to go after them. And yet these groups are in trouble because Western governments are finally, after several decades, starting to wake up to the fact that these charities subsidize terror. Another one worthy of mention is called Helping Hand for Relief and Development. It's an arm of the Islamic Circle of North America, another group that Abha just mentioned. It's their overseas foreign aid arm. We caught Helping Hand for Relief and Development in 2017, working openly with Lashkar-e-Taiba. They ran a conference together in Pakistan. And after we released that information and after several follow-up articles, Helping Hand and Jamaat-e-Islami is now lobbying in Congress against the Middle East Forum, trying to downplay our research, trying to discredit us. We know we've struck a nerve. But the point is this, is that charity is key to advancing ideology. It is an intrinsic part of the global Islamist scene. India finds groups like Helping Hand for Relief and Development, groups like Islamic Relief, groups like Muslim Aid, operate not just on the Pakistani side of the LOC, but also within India itself. And something that we're very keen for the Indian government to do is to examine these groups, study their activities. What are they doing in India? Eventually, I would presume these groups are worthy of designation in India. They should be banned. We published an article just last month looking at some of Muslim Aid's links to existing Islamist groups in India through this interesting network in both Hyderabad and Birmingham. Muslim Aid officials are connected to other prominent Islamists operating within India itself, including groups like the Zakat Foundation of India, which is linked to PFI, and other groups. So that's charity, and that's the huge issue, not just for India, but for Western governments around the world, how to balance the philanthropic efforts of Islamists with the direct violent threat that they pose. My argument is ban them. Ban these groups. There are certainly Muslim charities that don't fund terrorism. Why should we be enabling and Why should Western governments be funding those charities that do? The other point here is understanding that while the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami are the political faces of Islamism in the West, they're not the only faces of Islamism in the West. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to show that these two groups are declining in terms of sheer influence among Western Muslim communities. What is replacing them is a very interesting new clerical form of Islamism. And odd as it may sound, Islamism has traditionally not been clerical. Islamism has always been more spoken at the political preacher in the park rather than the preacher at the pulpit. Clerics have always underpinned Islamism, but they haven't always led it. And that's changing in the last decade, especially in the US, especially in the West. As much of the Arab world is currently moving towards some form of reform, in the West, groups like the Salafis, groups like the Deobandis are changing dramatically. Just a generation ago, these movements eschewed all involvement in politics. They rejected it almost completely. Those that were not quietists were jihadists, essentially, but the rest would just avoid the question, even though they supported Islamist ideas, even though they supported theocratic states that would involve the destruction of India, the destruction of Europe, the destruction of the world as we know it. They did not get involved in political matters. That's changing dramatically so. In the last few years, we've seen what we call modernist strains of Deobandi Islam and Salafi Islam get involved in politics and start to supplant groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, groups like Jamaat-e-Islami as the political voices of Islamism in the West. This is very true in America, but also in Europe. Now, what this means is that we're now starting to see clerics from these two huge Salafi and Deobandi movements get involved on things like Kashmir. And some of the most popular imams in America right now, people like Omar Suleiman, who was invited by Nancy Pelosi to address the American Congress and is widely praised in the media and frequently on television and so on. We're now seeing him speak out on the issue of Kashmir, set up his own events. What I mean by this is the traditional outlets of anti-Israel, of anti-Indian, of anti-Western fervor in the Islamist world, in the West, are being expanded to include new groups with new resources funded by Qatar and other extremist states, with this time entire congregations of mosques all around the country at their disposal. This is the Salafis and Deobandis have grassroots power in a way that the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami have never quite had in the West. They had to rely on selling their influences more influential than they actually were. The Salafis and the Deobandis have the natural congregants of their mosques to fall back on. This does include terrorism as well. We've seen increasing evidence that Deobandi mosques, especially on the east coast of the United States, may be funding Jaish-e-Mohammed and possibly other terrorist groups as well. This is a complicated subject, and even just the four Islamist movements I've named are not the only Islamist movements operating in the West. I'll give you one last example. In Texas at the moment, there's a considerable network that's pushing the Stand with Kashmir agenda. These groups are running events almost once a week with not just politicians in the US, these online webinars where politicians come and speak, but also family members of Kashmiri terrorists and prominent, I'm so sorry, my thing is making a noise, and also prominent activists from the Islamist scene as well. So there are these whole new networks that are operating, these whole new groups set up to demonize India, to advance extremism, to advance terror. We're at the beginning of the research phase and understanding who these groups are and who these networks are. And we hope to work with ABHA and IPT and also anyone who help us from India to understand these international networks, because more so than ever over the last few months, it's been made painfully clear that the threats India faces are the threats that we here in America face. This is a global ideology and it requires a global response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your amazing insights on the subject. I'll come back to you with the questions, but before that, I'll request Cliff to share his thoughts on the subject.
So my job at the Middle East Forum is I'm the Washington Project Director, as was previously said, and essentially that means I am the government affairs guy. I talk to Congress, I talk to the administration, I talk to other think tanks around the town. Sometimes I talk to journalists, so on and so forth. I do some research and writing as well, but my main job is sort of the politics of the situation, trying to get our research out there to people, trying to influence policy and opinion in Washington, D.C. I bring that up because I'm going to discuss this sort of from a political angle, sort of look at it from a political angle, see how this kind of the stuff that Sam and Abha are speaking of affect politics in DC and therefore around the world. Let me start by looking at three broad categories. This is very broad, that are sort of the anti-Indian forces in the U.S. The forces that are skeptical of the U.S. relationship with India, the forces that are trying to change the challenge of the Indian government, challenge the U.S. India relationship, and so on. First, there are groups that Indian Americans and Indians more broadly, frankly, from my point of view, often obsess over, and those are Pakistan-sponsored groups. Those absolutely exist. It was reported in one report recently that Arif Khan, the president of PTI Houston, Imran Khan's party, was big on arranging an anti-Modi rally. That absolutely exists. He is pretty clearly linked directly to Pakistan funds, so on and so forth. That is a force in the U.S. It does matter. However, I would argue that that is in many ways sort of secondary to the larger problem. Another category of groups is the South Asian Islamist groups, such as the Islamic Circle of North America, which both Sam and Abha mentioned, and Helping Hands for Relief and Development, which is a subsection of Islamic Circle of North America, the charitable arms that Sam was speaking of. These are also very important and are the people you might expect to be interested in it. These are people that are Muslims that have an Islamist ideology that are involved in politics. So obviously, to the degree that anybody in the American side is going to be interested in taking sort of an anti-Indian side on Kashmir or any other issue, it's probably going to be those people. Then you have another category. You have the Middle Eastern Islamist groups, usually associated primarily with being anti-Israel. Groups linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, such as CARE, which Abha and Sam mentioned, such as Islamic Society of North America, an entirely different group. This is the group that Imran Khan spoke to when he came to the US not long ago. And at all of the above, the hard left, which is generally skeptical of America and its interest in general, basically see America as being a force for bad in the world, tend to align with any of these groups. As I mentioned, I think Indians tend to gravitate towards the Pakistan-sponsored activism, thinking that is the real problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem, and I also think that those kinds of activists tend to partner with the other sorts of activists I mentioned. I do think, however, that that is secondary to the people that already have an ideological axe to grind, that have a political axe to grind, that help fuel it, but it is not the primary problem. And it's also true, I want to point out that all these groups are not mutually exclusive. Many South Asian Islamist groups have been critical of Israel. Many Middle Eastern groups for many long period of time, groups that have their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood or other Middle Eastern Islamic movements, have from time to time said things about Kashmir. But it is still true that the Middle Eastern Islamist groups have the most skin in the game, but that all of them work together. However, and this is what gets more interesting, is that the Middle Eastern Islamist groups have far more experience, greater numbers, and a ready-made messaging machine and alliances in the political world in a way that I think a lot of the South Asian Islamist groups or some of the other groups that take anti-Indian stances really do not. There's a reason why Imran Khan spoke at ISNA. It is a large established organization. They partner with other groups frequently, so on and so forth. There's a reason Nihat Awad, a Palestinian who helped found CARE, was speaking at anti-Kashmir rallies basically from day one, as soon as the stuff after the Pulwama attacks and after the abrogation of 370 happened. They have been a driving force of the wider Islamist ideology for a very long time. This, of course, is partially tactical. As Sam mentioned, the Middle East has largely, slowly, imperfectly for sure, but been slowly moving in a less Islamist direction for the most part. There are notable exceptions: Qatar, Turkey, so on and so forth. But the UAE-Israel peace deal is just further evidence of the more moderate direction that the Middle East is going. That is not going to suit Muslim Brotherhood founded groups, people with Muslim Brotherhood-centric ideologies, so on and so forth. So, in a sense, they have used the Palestinian cause, which is now sort of falling on disfavor internationally, at least with a lot of their traditional backers. They need a new rallying point. So part of this is purely tactical. And of course, part of this is ideological. While there are many stripes of Islamists, the fundamental goal of Islamic theocracy remains the same. No matter what you disagree on in terms of who should run it or what's, particular flavor it should take, all these Islamist groups basically agree with that. And this is not unique to America, of course. Abha mentioned something interesting. She mentioned the USCMO, the umbrella group that founded in 2014 that worked with all these different Islamist groups. During this exact same period of time, Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan held a mass rally, a military drill really, where they flew Palestinian flags, and then they posted this on Facebook with the caption, "We are all Hamas." I mentioned this in a recent article I wrote. This sort of ideological and tactical cooperation did not start in the US, it didn't finish in the US, it is all across the globe. Both Kashmir and the Palestinian territories represent an area of the world that was once under Muslim rule, and it has a majority Muslim population and is no longer. This is an anathema to Islamists. And so, in that sense, this entire thing moves back around together. I want to point out, however, that this has real-world effects in Congress, in the U.S. Tons of Indian commenters have noted how many of the news organizations seem hostile to India, seem to have a very distorted view of the kinds of things that are going on. This is not an accident. The views of these Islamist organizations that are going to take every misstep of India, that are going to take every real or perceived grievance and blow it up, completely ignoring the role of the jihadists, completely ignoring the actual goal of Islamist organizations and terrorist organizations in the region and abroad, are many. And they have been working on these kinds of issues, not necessarily directly related to India, but related to Israel and other targets for decades. Put another way, there is a reason why Ilhan Omar, who had previously only been known as an anti-Israel member of Congress, went out of her way to attend the hearing on South Asian human rights, which ended up mostly being a hearing on Kashmir, to attack Arti Singh, the Kashmiri pandit who was a reporter and who had suggested, fairly mildly, that jihadist groups are at the root of the problem in Kashmir. She attacked them using the same kind of talking points and basically frame of reference that the Islamist groups have been pushing pretty much since this entire issue hit a boiling point. She comes with baggage, as I like to point out. She was praised by former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke for her extreme anti-Israel, anti-Semitic statements. And that comes with baggage, but she also comes with a pre-existing audience on the hard left, a pre-existing audience with the Islamists, and a constituency that is interested in making these things happen. So this network of Islamists that includes not just Indian Islamists, but Middle Eastern Islamists, was able to really score a PR coup by getting her to make their case in Congress for them. The takeaway is this. Too many in India think they are being judged on Kashmir, on CAA, on the broader US-Indian relationship, based on classical criteria. They think that they are like Japan or Spain or someplace like that, and that America's interests in those countries are going to be treated similarly. I think that's mistaken. There is a concerted effort on the part of India's foes, mostly made up of Islamists, many of which are not from Pakistan or not from India or not from Bangladesh or not from anywhere in South Asia, but are from the Middle East or Europe or homegrown Islamists in the U.S. That want to treat it as something different. They want to have a special wedge issue, much like Israel has presented itself increasingly in U.S. politics. And to the degree that this is not pushed back upon, it will work sort of like it has with Israel.
When it comes to the US and the effects that Islamist networks have on government, have on there I can help you. And especially with this election season, the Islamists are organized politically in the US in a way there are in no other country. We're about a month away from a presidential election right now. We have Engage, a very large Islamist group closely involved with the Biden campaign. Engage is linked to a lot of, for its officials, is linked to a lot of activism on Kashmir against India. It's linked to existing groups that you've heard Abha mention, like the Council on Islamic Relations, that you've heard Cliff mention, the Islamic Society of North America. Meanwhile, across the country, Islamists are setting up donor clubs and PACs, which are vehicles for funding political candidates. They're coordinating individual contributions to various state and federal races. They're sponsoring legislation in not just in Congress, but in state legislatures across the country as well. American Islamists seem to take a conscious decision about 2-3 years ago to get really actively involved in politics in a way they'd never been before. They've always been a voice of protest. They'd always been campaigning on the streets or complaining to their legislators. Now they're running candidates. Now they're setting up training projects for new candidates. They're trying to secure American Islamist influence over American politics for the next generation.
Does the West has any particular strategy to monitor the funds which organizations like Muslim Brotherhood raise? NGOs like Islamic Relief, which is a part of Muslim Brotherhood, raises significant funds which are sent to India. Now here, I would also like to add something. Recently, I was in Kashmir doing a lot of research for my upcoming book on terror financing in Kashmir. So, when we study terror financing, it's a big question whether all these funds being raised by these Islamist charities, are they being funneled towards terrorism? I realize it's a very tricky question, but then certainly there are a lot of routes, because we have come across various Hawala channels and the use of NGOs in funneling money towards terrorist organizations. What's your take on that?
As I mentioned in my spiel earlier, most of these charities fund indirectly. They fund through third parties, through proxies. That's not to say that charities have not been caught funding terrorists directly in the past. They have, and I mentioned the partnership with Lashkar-e-Taiba. I mentioned the mosques that are funding Jaish-e-Mohammed. So this is happening. We don't know the full extent. It is incredibly difficult to track financial movements across, not even across borders, within America, it's difficult to track it. These charities, even when we go through their tax returns, they'll move money to one group, which itself disperses money to 5 other groups, which then in turn get money is laundered through and through these different. On top of that, there are, across the West, there are some really stupid systems of financial accountability. In the UK, for example, the Charity Commission would allow charities to give a certain amount of their money to other charities to implement projects, but that other charity doesn't have to report exactly how that money was spent. In other words, you can move money around pretty damn easily without having to account for where it went or anyone else having to account for how they got it. It is incredibly difficult to track the money. This is why terror finance prosecutions are pretty rare in the West when it comes to charities. This is why European governments, rather than deal with the problem, just ignore it pretty much. The Charity Commission, the regulator of charities in the UK, is a good example of this. It's investigated Muslim Aid 4 or 5 times in the last 10 years, including one that's just going on at the moment. And every time, even when they find evidence of terror finance, their conclusion is, don't do it again. They don't prosecute, they don't censure in any way. They just say, don't do it again. Every now and again, they'll appoint a temporary trustee to overlook charity, but that's about it. It's very difficult to work out what the charity is doing. It's even more difficult to work out how they're spending their money overseas, in Kashmir, in the Gaza Strip. This is a huge challenge, and my dream one day is to have an army of financial forensic accountants to go through the books of these charities and to follow their activities in minute detail. But for the moment, the most helpful thing that India could do is investigate these charities spending from their side, see what they're doing in Kashmir, see what they're doing in India, look at their local partners, look at the grants they make and the grants they receive, help build a global financial picture of these charities' activities.
I just want to add to Sam, and I just want to go a little bit into history as well of terror financing in the United States. And, I spoke about the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development. And I said that, senior leaders were convicted of funding over $12 million to Hamas. And all these funds were being raised on US soil. So prior to 2001, they were openly inviting Hamas sheikhs to fundraise in the country. And we didn't have the systems in place. And a lot of money was being raised over here in the United States and funneled overseas. Hezbollah, Hamas, they were fundraising on US soil. But I think what happened after 2001 was the IRS got so much more alert. Law enforcement has clamped down on terror financing. So now it's very hard for us to actually track the money. But my belief is that, a lot of these groups, they have connections with Qatar, with Turkey, and they are fundraising over here in the United States, vast amounts of money. So you would wonder, is money changing hands in, Qatar and, Turkey and elsewhere? And is then the money going into, terrorism? So, I do think now, maybe they're taking the money there to, somehow, third parties are involved, which is, Turkey and Qatar. But it's harder kind of, fundraising for jihad over here and directly sending money to the terrorists, the way it was done in the past, because if, IRS oversight, it's just become very kind of, effective. So it can't be done anymore.
Well, let me add one thing that just to throw a little bit of cold water on this. I think to a degree, it's worth asking, how much does it matter? And by that is what I mean is not that terror finance is bad, but that a lot of these charitable groups, let's say for the sake of argument, which I don't buy, but let's say for the sake of argument, 100% of their charity goes to what you and I would call charity. Okay, if that charity is being directed by Jamaat-e-Islami, if that charity is being directed by groups that have a theocratic agenda and clear ties and clear sympathies with terrorists, it doesn't matter that much. There's a famous scene in a favorite movie of mine, American Gangster, where they have the head of this drug cartel passing out turkeys to poor families in Christmas. What was he doing that for? He was doing it to gain influence in the community, to basically buy support for his drug empire. It really isn't different. I'm not saying it's not worth looking into it, because in the West, when you cross that final line into actually buying subsidizing a terrorist organization, that makes a legal huge difference. But even the left-leaning leaders, including now Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, famously said, if you help Hezbollah build homes, you help Hezbollah build bombs. And so to a degree, you're always going to be playing whack-a-mole with these kinds of people, insofar as people with these extreme ideologies will find a way to spend the money to support their extremist ideologies, whether it's explicitly funding terrorism or not. So the more fundamental issue is looking at who you're giving money to, looking at who is getting money, making sure they are not radical theocrats. And that is something, frankly, the West has been, particularly America, frankly, even more so than Europe, has been very hesitant to do. Neither America nor Europe has been particularly good at it. But especially the US, they have this idea of freedom of religion, which I think is great, but not so far as when it goes to actually excusing bad acts in the name of freedom of religion. When you are consciously and obviously pushing an ideology that is pushing for violence and the overthrowing of legitimate states. That's something very different. So I would just not. So I don't want to go so far as to say that it doesn't matter. What I do want to say is you need to look at the bigger picture when you're thinking about this, because ultimately, the money will find a way if the ideology is the driving force behind why it is being given and why it is being distributed.
Thank you. There is one more question. I think ideally this question should be directed to someone who is a finance expert, but I'll just put across the question in case if anyone wants to take it up. The question is from Mr. Prasad. According to FATF report, the use of NPOs for terror finance is an established modus operandi, with some charities demanding donations in virtual currencies. The tracking and monitoring would be challenging. What sort of counterterrorism measures would you foresee to mitigate this risk?
The use, especially of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency for terror finance, is a huge issue right now. And at least 10 years, as long as 10 years ago, it became apparent that in the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were getting involved in this whole area of financial transaction. It's a huge issue. And because these cryptocurrencies famously secure the anonymity of both seller and buyer, it's almost impossible. I understand that there's been a number of intelligence operations in the last few years where Western governments have managed to track Bitcoin and even use Bitcoin as part of some trap to ensnare someone. I don't know the details. Regardless, this is a huge issue and will be extremely difficult. We have enough trouble tracking the movement of monies just through family transactions, let alone the enormous charities. You introduce cryptocurrency into this and these highly secure private movements of money that can break international limits on spending across borders and importing of money into certain countries. There's no good way to stop this. This is going to be a huge problem unless we can convince the main cryptocurrency companies to get on board and work with law enforcement on this issue. But here's the point, that cryptocurrency is a completely wild field. There are thousands of cryptocurrency companies. Everyone's heard of Bitcoin. Who's heard of I saw one the other day, a type of cryptocurrency that's pegged to the price of bananas. There are some really obscure pieces of cryptocurrency out there, and every single one of these financial systems can be used to move money across borders without the knowledge of government and in the support of terror. This is very worrying. I'm not an expert on the subject. I have no solutions for you. But from what I've read and from people I've spoken to, there are no good solutions at the moment to this ever-increasing threat.
Thanks, Sam. So I have a question. I mean, this is directed to all of you. Like when it comes to the government, the US government, so I feel that, they like fully understand India's sensitivities and India's, I would say, vulnerabilities in Kashmir, and they kind of support our measures, okay? Security and communication lockdown, and they understand. But when it comes to the local municipal governments, we have come across cases where they're passing resolutions against the CAA, NRC, against Article 370, even USCRI as a body is totally anti-India. So, I mean, it's just we fail to understand what's the reason. Are these Islamist groups so powerful in terms of lobbying and influencing these governments at the local level or even at the high level?
Really briefly, I mean, yes, essentially is the answer to your question. I mean, the idea that the Seattle City Council or the Minneapolis City Council or some of these other people that have passed resolutions concerning, Indian legislation, I don't even want to talk about the CAA or any of these other things on substance. It's totally irrelevant. There is no good reason for city councils to get involved in things like this. And pretty much you almost every single time you can see anything like this, you can bet it is some organization that has a direct interest in that is basically manipulating people that either already know what they think. In other words, you have people that already have a dyed-in-the-wool hardcore ideology that they just want to use their any platform to espouse, or they simply don't know what they're talking about at all and are going along with the first thing they hear, which shows the value of the kind of very tightly organized, well-organized political Islamists that I talked about, that Abha mentioned, so on and so forth. And that shows you sort of how they're playing the game. They're not interested at this point in, and they don't have the power to, fundamentally change U.S. policy overnight. What they do have the power to do is sort of change the nature of the debate, much like they have on Israel, as I mentioned. Again, I'm not singling out Israel just for its own sake. It's just that is a particularly good example of the way these kinds of things have been done in the past, and how these things are working on issues related to India as well.
Thank you, Cliff. And there's just one more thing. So I would say it's not just the local municipal governments, but some of your very prestigious think tanks, very eminent ones. I'm not naming them. They published articles, written by some very prominent, prestigious Indian professors, but unfortunately, when I read them, I mean, they were just a pack of big lies, Okay. For instance, the government of India banned Jamaat-e-Islami, and some people are writing that, you're banning a charity organization. Okay. For instance, another example, the government of India had the security or communication lockdown. It's a well-known fact that most of these militant groups, they chat using all these encrypted applications. And if after removing Article 370, if we had not implemented this communication lockdown, they would have created a complete havoc in the state. So why all these very prestigious think tanks committed to the cause of democracy and multiculturalism? They are just, caving in, like completely surrendering to all these Islamist, jihadist, and hardcore extremist groups. And even the intellectuals, I mean, masquerading as intellectuals, but actually committed to the jihadist cause.
Yeah, I think this is true, and there are three types of people I suppose that the public trust to produce accurate information and that we can base policy on. Academics, civil servants, think tank staffers. All three are guilty of making a lot of things up, whether out of an ideological agenda or too lazy to investigate or research the truth. This is a perennial problem. You just have to look at certain think tanks, which I also won't name, funded by foreign states, such as Qatar, in this country and in Europe, to see the kind of information they publish, and you can see that it's nakedly serving an extremist agenda. It's not even just bad research; it's outright lies. When it comes to India, yes, I think I've seen quite a bit to what you're referring, published by some fairly prominent think tanks. This shouldn't be a surprise, but we have to remember that think tanks are not objective purveyors of truth. These are political organizations by their very nature, and therefore they have a political agenda. Like many people with a political agenda, they'll choose the facts that suit their worldview. And India is certainly the enemy in a lot of worldviews right now, both on the far left, both in the Islamist world, but even in parts of the center left as well. So this is alarming, and the response to this is to challenge them at every turn, is to rebut their essays, is to write letters to the newspapers that publish their articles, is to counter their work in peer-reviewed journals. It's challenge them. That's all that can be done. The amount of disinformation that India is currently experiencing, I suggest, is very small compared to what it will be facing in a few years' time, if Israel is anything to go by. If the demonization campaign against India continues in the same way that it did for decades against Israel, the amount of lies, the amount of deceit, the amount of disinformation will increase exponentially. And what you're seeing now is just a taste of an international coalition of deceit that's about to envelop for the narrative about India. Like Israel, India right now should be, well, not just people like you should be writing about this and combating these lies, which you are, but the government should be setting up institutions to fight this war, this ideological battle, this misinformation battle, fight them back, go after them, expose the sources of fake news that seek to demonize India. Israel learned quite a while ago that you have to be proactive with this stuff. You can't just ignore it and let it sit and hope that eventually the truth will win out. No, you have to proactively push the truth. You have to dismantle the lies. You have to go after the liars. I recommend India does the same.
And also I want to add to that, and I agree with Sam, that a lot of these think tanks, they are funded by foreign governments. There's Qatari money, there's other money coming in, and that's why they're towing the Islamist line. But in connection with India, I think a lot of the think tanks, they're headed also by individuals that are anti-Modi government, anti-BJP. And you see this kind of division within India itself. You have the liberal elite, and then you have, the larger population. And a lot of them don't like, the Prime Minister Modi or the BJP government, and they write very negative things about it. So I think that has transferred over here to the United States, because a lot of the individuals who are, working with these think tanks are also a product of the liberal elite in India. And they have a different perception of Modi, his agenda, the BJP, and they are more old school in that regard, and prefer that India follow a more defensive rather than proactive policy with its neighborhood, including, of course, with Pakistan and now with China.
Thanks, Abha and Sam. Okay, so I mean, given the background which you have set with your answers, I really worry, like, if the US is so vulnerable to all these influence operations, foreign funding, the future seems very bleak, because now we have these two powers like China, a totalitarian power, totally hands in glove with Islamist powers, the rogue states, and both these groups are like really great at influence operations, buying people, managing media, think tank. So if this is the situation, I really wonder what's going to happen after like 5 years, 10 years, and especially if the Democrats win the election, okay, how it is going to affect the American commitment towards the India's war against terrorism and the related issues.
Let me speak to that a little bit. I want to be a little bit more sunshiny on some of this. It is absolutely true that the Islamists have, are controlling or have controlled largely the political response to Kashmir at a congressional level, and to some degree in the administration, even mostly with career bureaucrats and some political appointees and so forth. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true that China is pretty good at throwing its weight around influence-wise, so on and so forth. All of that is of concern. However, and this is a pretty big however, I think you have to recognize the fact that, especially after COVID, even before COVID, but especially after COVID, China has about as bad of an image in the US as you're going to get these days. Most Americans are not on board with the Islamist agenda. What you are working with is sort of a low information public that they hear something negative about, an innocent child was caught in the crossfire between, Hizbul Mujahideen and Indian troops, and they see a picture of an injured child. Oh, this is terrible. Well, sure, it's terrible. But that's not the whole story. My point is that India does not start from a neutral standpoint vis-a-vis China or even vis-a-vis Islamists. I think, generally speaking, your average American recognizes that India is a relatively democratic country with people have relatively good individual rights and so forth. I think that is being diminished, particularly on the left, by these forces. But I don't think that is fundamentally starting off, in an equal playing field with its opponents. I don't think that's true. So I think while they are currently, not doing particularly well on certain issues, I do not think they start from a bad position. So I wouldn't be that unsunshiny about it. I think there's a lot of room for concern, but a lot of room for hope. As far as what's going to happen if the Democrats win, that's awfully difficult to tell. There's no doubt that Trump has gotten close to Modi, that he has tried to portray himself as a very pro-Indian president. There's no doubt that the Republican Party certainly is much more sympathetic to pluralistic democracies and much less concerned about groups with extremist ideologies claiming to be oppressed, so on and so forth. That said, there's a whole lot to go through on Biden's record on India. He's been around for a very long time. But everything I know of it, he's not overtly hostile. Now, part of his base is hostile for the very reasons we've discussed. But that wasn't the base that got him the nomination. It's just part of the Democratic Party right now. Biden largely has carte blanche on what kind of president he wants to be. I fear that his career shows that he has been something of a left-leaning windsock. I think he will be to the right of Bernie Sanders, to the right of AOC, certainly to the right of Ilhan Omar, but well to the left of America, and perhaps even left to the center of his party. So that's cause for concern. That said, when you have a much older man becoming president with no obvious base of support that he must play to, having won the nomination almost on a fluke, with his opposition sort of just scattered, he really has a blank slate. It'll be difficult to say. I think there's a lot of cause for concern for India should he win. I do not think there's cause for panic, and I think there's a lot of room he has to play with, and I honestly am not 100% sure where he'll come down on some of this stuff.
I would just want to add Cliff as well. And Cliff, I agree with him that, it won't be the best scenario if it is a Biden administration for US-India relations, but it won't be bad either, because one important issue is China. And there's bipartisan support for standing up to China. And India is the only country, allied country, that shares such a long border with China. So the West, the United States, needs India to fight its war against China, to contain China. So India is going to be very important from that aspect. But come a Biden administration, there's going to be greater pressure on the Modi government when it comes to so-called human rights abuses in Kashmir, or the alleged persecution of Indian Muslims. So there's going to be greater pressure to conform to human rights when it comes to these issues. But I think the importance of India cannot be played down because China is a big factor, and the world wants India to be an important player in the containment of China.
Thanks, Abha, and thanks, Cliff. So we have one more question from Dr. Ratal. It's, as the Islamic lobby is too big, having made inroads into the major government organizations and the media in the West and in India too, how wise it would be to make the government realize that the same and put some stop to the trend, as it is very dangerous for the world peace and we need to stem the tide.
Why and how does the government not stem the growing influence of Islamist lobbyists? Is that the question?
Yes, Sam. Even I would like to add to this question. Like, you mentioned that we should ban these organizations in India, but in US also, having known it well that they have very strong Salafi leanings and the totalitarian agenda, why are not they being banned in America? Why don't we come across a very robust action against them in the West?
Okay. Well, there are two things here. One, the charities and why they're not banned, and then two, the lobbyists. So I'll start with the charities. After 9/11, there was a spate of criminal prosecutions against terror charities, the most famous being one that Abha first mentioned in her opening talk, which the Holy Land Foundation, which led to the a number of very prominent Islamist groups being implicated in that trial. But since then, with the exception of one or two cases against minor charities, most investigations into Islamist charities have started, but then they've been shut down, often because of political pressure. A very prominent one is the SAFA network, or the SAR network in Herndon, Virginia, huge network of companies and charities that were laundering money for terrorists, and a decade-long investigation by law enforcement was closed down overnight at the beginning of the Obama administration's time. So yes, political involvement and influence plays a bit of a role in this. My great hope at the moment is that the federal government is investigating these charities. We've seen a number of pieces of evidence to suggest that some of the Jamaat-e-Islami charities I mentioned, some of the Muslim Brotherhood charities I mentioned, may be under federal investigation currently. We got a confirmation from the federal government when we requested some documents that mentioned Islamic Relief, that the charity was currently or had been under investigation. Helping Hand, the Jamaat-e-Islami charity that partnered with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan, one of their officials in New England was convicted last year of lying to the FBI when they were questioning him about laundering money for Lashkar-e-Taiba. So there is some evidence that criminal investigations are taking place. But in general, the West is pretty pusillanimous when it comes to tackling terror finance. I mentioned how appalling the British have been when it comes to charity regulator. And for example, from British that always shocked me which is that a report a few years ago in the Charity Commission's Regulator of Charities releases a report every year talking about what it's done, the states of the charitable infrastructure in the United Kingdom. They released a report saying, we went to a charity's office to make a surprise visit. On the wall, we saw the leader of a designated terrorist group. Now, I happen to know which charity it was, and that person on the wall was, the portrait was Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, the terrorist group tied to the Iranian regime. And the charity commission said, we saw this terrorist leader as the main picture on the wall of this charity's offices. We were quite shocked, so we hand them a leaflet saying how to better manage your charity. This is what the British do. They hand out leaflets and they advise them not to do it again. This is why London has always been the terror finance capital of the world. It's why it always will continue to be the terror finance capital of the world. In the face of British inaction, of British stupidity, and of American political cowardice, India can take the lead in going after some of the Western charities operating in your backyard. Groups like Muslim Aid, groups like Helping Hand, groups like Islamic Relief, which are operating in India, despite their links to Kashmiri terrorists, despite their links to Islamists across South Asia. Yeah, India can do a great deal, and we hope they step up in a way that America and the rest of Europe has not. As for the lobbyists, I'm not sure what to say. You know, they're operating lawfully. They're operating exactly as lobbyists should for the most part. We haven't really come across evidence of unlawful use. Perhaps the few areas where sometimes it may be a little concerning from a legal standpoint is that a lot of Islamist groups, foreign Islamist groups, appear to be keen to influence domestic politics. And it's not always clear they're going through the proper channels to do that, not declaring foreign agents and registering them with the US government. There's also concern over how Islamist PACs, the committees set up to fundraise for campaign candidates, it's not always clear that they're operating completely reasonably as well. It seems that a lot of them serve I won't comment on this, actually, sorry, because I risk saying something I don't fully understand. But all to say is that it's very interesting how little money the PACs report giving, despite the enormous amount they raise. So there's questions around how these Islamist PACs are operating. All that to say that these groups are managing mostly to stay within the confines of the law. I don't think there is a good way to combat this other than fighting the threat of Islamism more generally, more broadly.
Let me add one thing here. I have to be a little bit cryptic because I can't necessarily talk about this what people tell me publicly. But as Sam alluded to earlier, under George W. Bush's administration, after 9/11, there was a fair amount of going after charities that worked with terrorists. There was an attempt to sort of break up these networks. That ended under the Obama administration for ideological reasons, essentially. The hard left and Obama, you can debate all day just how left he was. He certainly, at minimum, enabled a lot of hard leftists in his administration. Basically saw any persecution of any Islamic charity prosecution as persecution, is what I'm trying to say. That they saw it as being purely anti-Muslim based on nothing but innuendo and happenstance, and basically shut down, if not all, certainly shut it down as a focus. And that was done for purely political and ideological reasons. Under the Trump administration, I can just tell you this much. I have a source who has been in and around the intelligence community for some time, which told me pretty much point blank that under the Bush administration, we did this. Under the Obama administration, we weren't really allowed to. Under the Trump administration, they are monomaniacally focused on the southern border. In other words, they are aware of some of these things that are going on. They're concerned. Their focus is on other things, and it is just not a priority. I think that's unfortunate because I think that while there are certainly reasons to be concerned about illegal immigrant smuggling and drug smuggling and such on America's southern border, I think monomaniacally focusing on it as the preeminent or almost even sole threat is a huge mistake. Nonetheless, given Trump's ideological proclivities and personal interest in this issue, that is likely to continue as long as he's president. I would like to tell you I would think this would get better if Biden wins. I don't think so. I think at best it will be perhaps slightly better than Obama, although it could easily be just as bad, if not worse. I do not expect this aspect to change. I wish I could say differently, but that's what I suspect.
Thanks, Cliff. Thank you. Since we're talking about terror, I mean, I think we're talking about how do these people raise funds, and the discussion has come to terror financing. I would just like to briefly add in some of my experiences. So recently, for my research on terror financing in this upcoming book, I came across some very interesting ways of raising funds. Jamaat-e-Islami, it's an Islamist organization, very active in Kashmir, and it was legally functioning. So they were so influential in the government that they would get people selected as teachers, as administrators, as police officers in the state government. And then they would be charging people as like some bribes to get those people selected. After these guys got into the services, they would share a part salary with these organizations, which I mean, it's very easy to predict where all that money goes. Then we have a very famous bank in Kashmir. All the operatives mostly came from the Jamaat-e-Islami background. One of its former chairman, his father almost recruited 200 militants. And the terrorists, the separatists, in fact, they got loans of 40 crores on the collateral of 10 lakhs. And if someone from Lashkar-e-Toiba would call the chairman of this bank, this guy would be selecting people on his recommendations. So all that mess was going on, but then the government got into action. And, after that, I mean, I'm not naming the bank for obvious reasons, but things are moving into a slightly different direction. Anyway, so I'm coming back to another question. The question is from Mr. Aditya Phatak. And the question is, when call them Islamist groups as anti-India and demonizing BJP, is this terminology a shorthand for anti-Hindu, especially when we say Middle East is supposedly moving away from Islamist conservatives? Aditya, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry for being, I mean, being an Indian, I tend to write in noodles. So I should apologize for that. I just wanted to ask you, because I have heard this ad nauseum about it's been written about as anti-India forces. So what exactly is this? Is this anti-Hindu? Is this anti-idea of India? Or is it just plain opportunism? Because these terms are used interchangeably. Are we talking about in the same way, or is it just purely anti-Hindu in some sense?
I see. Well, I think that depends who's doing the anti-Indian thing. If we're talking about Islamists, obviously anti-Hinduism lies at the heart of well, to an extent, the birth of Islam, and certainly the groups like the Salafis and any other Islamists who seek this purer form of Islam seek the ideals of the early days of Islam, in which the pagans of the East, in other words, the Hindus, were seen as the ultimate enemy, far worse than the Christians or the Jews, because they were idolaters. They had multiple gods. So the Islamists despise Hindus, and something 10 years ago I noticed a lot of, and I didn't catalogue, and I really wish I had, was the sheer venom attributed given to Hindus in Islamist mosques and community centers and charitable events that I used to monitor. And I didn't think much of it then. I'm not sure what I put it down to. I wish I'd catalogued it, because it was a sign of the ever increasing anti-Indian sentiment that was to come. Today, across the US, you can still find evidence of Islamists involved with the groups like Stand with Kashmir and other anti-Indian efforts being openly anti-Hindu. Their partners, their collaborators, the far left groups they work with, the center left and the centrists they work with, I think have been persuaded along not along anti-Hindu lines, but along anti-Modi lines, and that the majority of the effort against India revolves around this idea that Modi is this far-right fascist type leader, akin to the worst Zionists or the worst neoconservatives, or in the most extreme rhetoric, Hitler himself. So this is the typical misinformation of the left. The Islamists very much feed this misinformation, but privately, yes, they hate you because you're Hindu. That's That's certainly their reasoning.
Two more questions before we wrap up. Okay? So I think so far we discussed a lot about Islamist organizations and the charities which believe in kind of a Salafi radical ideology. But then I guess, there are many people, the great Islamic religious scholars, someone like Shri Fethullah Gulen, Mr. Fethullah Gulen. He has been doing amazing work in the field of education. In India also, I have come across various instances where he has been interacting with the various religious Hindus, from the Hindu community and from the other religious communities. And time and again, he has emphasized that that Islam also believes in a very democratic world and respecting other people's faiths and ideologies. So why people like Mr. Fethullah Gulen are not able to influence the government and influence the public opinion in the USA? I'm sure, I'm pretty sure he is a famous man. The US government knows well about him, and he's the one who can be effectively promoted to project a counter narrative. But all the American think tanks and the media groups, I just see a complete lack of effort in promoting people like him. Why? Is it money, or they're not just interested in people like him?
So Fethullah Gulen is a very interesting figure. I would certainly never think of him as a reformist voice or a true ally. What he is an enemy of our enemy. He is an opponent of Erdogan. He is an opponent of the Turkish regime, and that might make him temporarily useful. There are several problems here. Firstly, Gulen just a few years ago was a friend of the Turkish regime. His ideals, his beliefs at heart are just as dangerous as the very same Turkish regime that is currently sponsoring extremists in Kashmir. He has a much more benign reputation. And there are some people who do argue that ideologically, even though he was in bed with the worst extremists in Turkey, that his ideology is ultimately much more moderate. I've read some of his writing. It's certainly less explicitly extreme. Here's the point: Fethullah Gulen is still an Islamist. He may be an Islamist who seems less objectionable, but he's still an Islamist. And it's important to remember that. He's not in a position to influence government policy. He lives in a closed community in Pennsylvania. He runs efforts around the country. His only interfacing with the outside world is through his schools. He runs various charter schools, which are private schools funded by the taxpayer, sort of. It's a simplification, but that's sort of what they are. He gets involved with those, but the rest of the Gulen network is a closed circle that serves a closed community. He's not involved with the wider Muslim community. He never has been. He's not really involved with any political efforts outside his own immediate interests. This is not a voice of reform, both in the terms of his ideology, but also in terms of possibilities. He's not someone who holds any influence. If you actually want to speak about people who can be influential with the US government, who stand to oppose the Islamists on their own, using their own ideology, you should look towards reformist Islam. You should look towards reformist Muslims active in the US, and also there's a growing number in India. I keep coming across of people who agree with the reformist movement in the West and are promoting their views. In fact, India is one of the few places outside the West that I can see reformist Islam truly growing. These are the people we should be enabling. These are the people to challenge the Islamists, not cult leaders in Pennsylvania. That would be my suggestion.
Let me add something here. I'm going to sort of pass down a second-hand answer to this question because it might be of interest to people on this event. Recently, former Pakistani ambassador to the U.S., Hussein Haqqani, did a webinar for the Middle East Forum discussing South Asian Muslims in America. And he was quite explicit in his view that, his version of Islam, the version of Islam of many Muslims he knows and talks to and even holds discussion groups with and such, is much more moderate, that there's a history of the kind of thing you're talking about, of a more democratic, more moderate form of Islam. Basically, his view, when asked pretty much this exact question, was that all the money, all the institutional structures for Muslims in America, and I can't speak to India, but are much more routed to an Islamist point of view, and that it really would take a similar effort for a non-Islamist from a moderate Muslim point of view to really counteract it. And so far, he was saying that simply doesn't exist. I mean, he has done what he can on his part, but those voices do not have the kind of institutional support or money right now. It's just a fact. What does that mean in the future? Well, it doesn't mean good things. I hope more people will step up. But people like Hussein Haqqani, people like Majid Nawaz, people like Zuhdi Jasser that are in the West, that are Muslims, that have these kinds of discussions, are instantly attacked by Islamist organizations, and are instantly they try to drum them out of any sort of form of influence in the community. So you have to be realistic about it. It is a very big challenge that isn't going to go away overnight.
Thanks, Cliff. Before we wrap up, just one more question. I think the question is to Sam. Would you talk a little more about Tablighi Jamaat and the Islamization in Europe, with reference to the recent riots which took place in Sweden?
Yeah. So Tablighi Jamaat is, of course, of interest to me, and I follow its activities in Britain and the US fairly closely. I was at a black Salafi mosque. This is in the 1970s to now. A lot of Wahhabi groups reached out to African Americans, to Black Americans, convinced them to convert to Black Salafism, and or Salafism that just happened to be themed with sort of Black consciousness ideas. So there's a lot of black Salafi mosques around the US. And I was in one the other day speaking to the imam who invited me to the prayer room when it 1 o'clock, it was time to pray. And while I was there, two gentlemen from Tablighi Jamaat stood up at the end of prayers. And you can always tell a Tablighi because of the clothes he's wearing and the turban he adorns himself with, and invited everyone to a mosque down the road for a celebration the next week, and said there'll be financial support for those that attend. Tablighi Jamaat is everywhere. If you can find it in a mosque that caters specifically to graduates of the Black Power movement from the 1970s that converted to Islam, you can find it in any mosque. And their ability, despite being a Deobandi missionary organization from a very specific part of the world, their ability to appear in essentially any mosque in the country, across the US and across Europe, even at mosques controlled by Islamic strains of Islam that have traditionally disagreed with their theology, their ability to be everywhere and to convince every imam to let them speak and sleep in the main hall and indoctrinate their congregants is really quite extraordinary, and proof of its enormous power. And it's no surprise that it is, in terms of sheer numbers of membership, the largest Islamic group in the world, really, by most state of affairs. So Tablighi Jamaat is very influential. It has huge amounts of numbers. And for the last 3-4 decades, it's been tied to dozens of terror cases in the West. Now, every Indian is aware of Tablighi Jamaat, especially after the last few months and the beginning of the coronavirus. But in the US, its name is really known only by law enforcement, who have noticed that Western terrorists, as part of their radicalization process, tend often to graduate through Tablighi Jamaat ranks. Now, in some ways, that's not so surprising, given how prevalent Tablighi Jamaat is and how many mosques it is. But these terrorist recruits do more than that. They're not merely attending a Tablighi Jamaat event once in a while. They've been members. They've been involved with it formally. And while Tablighi Jamaat in the West eschews violence, technically, they certainly profess to be opposed to all forms of violence, there is no doubt that far too many terrorists pass through their doors. Far too many terrorists appear to, at one point, have learned their ideology. In the US, Tablighi Jamaat has official mosques. While in Europe, Tablighi Jamaat operates entirely secretly. In the US, it's a little more open. So it has a number of official mosques, both in New York and Los Angeles, where it openly identifies as a Tablighi Jamaat mosque. But by and large, its methods is the same as elsewhere. It travels, it sends missionaries around the country to conduct missions of a certain number of days, to indoctrinate, to inculcate their ideology to as many Muslims as possible. Their role is not to convert non-Muslims. Their role is to Islamize existing Muslims, make them more Muslim, make them Muslim according to the way that Tablighi Jamaat sees Islam. As for violence in Europe and accusations of involvement in things like the recent riots, the problem with Tablighi Jamaat is because it's so shadowy, because it's so ill-defined. I mean, Tablighi Jamaat doesn't even keep written records in most countries. They eschew even writing anything down. So because of this complete inability in most places to track who they are and their actual activities, it's very difficult to tell how involved they actually are with say, civil disturbance, civil unrest, or any other sort of notable event. We can see, as I say, that terrorists pass through their doors, but seeing that they're institutionally connected to problems in Europe is a lot harder to do. I would suggest, based on my understanding of Tablighi Jamaat, that they're probably not officially in any way connected to any recent disturbance. What they are is they're an extremist ideology that breeds a generation of young Muslims who are happy to get involved in extremist circumstances. And we should see Tablighi Jamaat as a dangerous movement, but we shouldn't see it as a specific organization. It's not. It just isn't. And it's impossible to designate, really, for that reason alone. That, as I say, that's not to discount the threat that it poses. That's not to discount the danger that it represents. And I know that the French government, the UK government, the American government have all looked into Tablighi Jamaat. They all believe it's a danger. They've all concluded there's not a huge amount that can be done about it. Again, countering the influence of Tablighi, here's actually what the case is. India is dealing with the threat of invasive Western Islamist charities, Islamic Relief, Muslim aid groups I've mentioned. We have to deal with those here in the West. The only people that can deal with Tablighi Jamaat really are the Indian authorities in India, where Tablighi Jamaat is, where its infrastructure is, where its finances are, where its representative bodies are. If we deal with the charities, you need to deal with the Tablighi Jamaat. Tablighi affects us in the same way that charities affect you. They're both groups are spreading terrorism. Both groups are subsidizing hate and violence, and targeted efforts in the UK, in the US, and India against charities and Tablighi are all required to tackle this threat wholesale. I wish I could give you a more concrete answer, but the whole point about Tablighi is that because it's so shadowy, because it lacks the clear infrastructure that other international movements have, it means I have to give an answer without structure as well, I fear. Do you have anything to add, Cliff or Abha?
No, I just, since I do follow, the terrorism cases in the United States, there have been several terrorism cases prosecuted in the United States that have connections with Tablighi Jamaat. And this goes back to the early 2000s. There was, of course, John Walker Lind. Then there was, the Lakwana 6, the 6 Yemeni Americans who were indicted for traveling overseas to train with Al-Qaeda. Then there's the dirty bomber, Jose Padilla, Portland 7, more recently the San Bernardino attack, in which Syed Farouk, who was the attacker, he was attending a Tablighi Jamaat mosque. So we have a number of terrorism cases tied to the Tablighi Jamaat in the United States as well.
And just to add, actually, at one point, the French estimated that 40% of their terrorists in Europe went through Tablighi Jamaat circles at one point. So this is not a coincidence. This is a regular mainstay of terrorist recruits.
Thank you, Sam, Abha, and Cliff, for educating us today about a very sensitive and a critical issue. I guess Indian academia, Indian society, and our intelligence setup need to devote their mental resources and financial resources in understanding this phenomenon of Islamist organizations and the threat posed by them. Only then we can come out with what Sam said, the targeted efforts to counter these organizations. Before I end, I also take this opportunity to celebrate India-US friendship. This is the alliance of democracies. Today, India is facing a very primitive and a barbaric threat on its northeastern borders, a threat which prefers to live in 18th century and carve out empires, and which refuses to play by the rules. So we stand united, committed firm and determined against the forces who want to violently overthrow the global order and unleash the forces of anti-democracy and religious extremism. And we shall win. We shall win very firmly. Thanks all of you. Thanks all the participants, and hope to see you very soon in our next webinar on some interesting issue. Thank you so much.